Story Mr. Mighty of his Mouth and Mr. Mighty of his Hands. In two adjoining villages there lived two famous men. The one was called Mr. Mighty of his Mouth, one that could accomplish wonders with words alone. The other was called Mr. Mighty of his Hands, one who could make no use of that glib instrument the tongue, but was able to bear burdens, cut wood, and perform other physical labor. It so happened that they agreed to live together in the house of the Mr. Mighty of his Mouth, to try and see which of them was the superior. They accordingly kept company for several months, till the great feast of the 9 nights, Navaratri, came on. On the first day of the feast, Mr. Mighty of his Hands wanted to sacrifice a goat to the goddess Kali. So he said to Mr. Mighty of his Mouth, "My dear friend, we both are mighty in our way, and so it would be shameful for us to buy the goat, that we want to sacrifice, with money. We should manage to get it without payment." "Yes, we must do so, and I know how," replied Mr. Mighty of his Mouth, and he asked his friend to wait till that evening. Now there lived a shepherd at 1 Ghatika's hours distance from their house, and the two friends resolved to go to his fold that night and steal away one of his goats. Accordingly, when it was dark, they approached his fold. The shepherd had just finished his duties to the mute members of his flock, and wanted to go home and have his rice hot. But he had no second person to watch the flock, and he must not lose his supper. So he planted his crook before the fold, and throwing his blanket, kambali, over it, thus addressed it, "My son, I am very hungry, and so must go for my rice. Till I return do you watch the flock. This wood is rich in tigers and goblins, bhutas. Some mischievous thief or bhuta, or kuta may come to steal away the sheep. Watch over them carefully." So saying, the shepherd went away. The friends had heard what the shepherd said. Of course, Mr. Mighty of his Mouth laughed within himself at this device of the shepherd to impress upon would-be robbers that he had left someone there to watch his sheep, while really he had only planted a pole and thrown a blanket over it. Mr. Mighty of his Hands, however, did not see the trick, and mistaking the stick to be an actual watchman sitting at his duty before the fold, spoke thus to his friend, "Now what are we to do? There is a watchman sitting in front of the fold." Thereon, Mr. Mighty of his Mouth cleared away his doubts by saying that it was no watchman, but a mere stick, and entered the fold with his friend. It had also so happened that on that very night a bhuta, goblin, had come into the fold to steal away a sheep. It shuddered with fear on hearing the shepherd mention the kuta, for having never heard of the existence of kutas, it mistook this imaginary being to be something superior in strength to itself. So thinking that a kuta might come to the fold, and not wishing to expose itself till it knew well what kutas were, the bhuta transformed itself into a sheep and laid itself down among the flock. By this time the two mighties had entered the fold and begun an examination of the sheep. They went on rejecting one animal after another for some defect or other, till at last they came to the sheep which was none other than the bhuta. They tested it, and when they found it very heavy, as, of course, it would be with the soul of the bhuta in it, they began to tie up its legs to carry it home. When hands began to shake it, the bhuta mistook the mighties for the kutas, and said to itself, "Alas! The kutas have come to take me away. What am I to do? What a fool I was to come into the fold." So thought the bhuta as Mr. Mighty of his Hands was carrying it away on his head, with his friend following him behind. But the bhuta soon began to work its devilish powers to extricate itself, and Mr. Mighty of his Hands began to feel pains all over his body and said to his friend, "My dear Mighty, I feel pains all over me. I think what we have brought is no sheep." Mr. Mighty of his Mouth was inwardly alarmed at the words of his friend, but did not like to show that he was afraid. So he said, "Then put down the sheep, and let us tear open its belly, so that we shall each have only one half of it to carry." This frightened the Buddha, and he melted away on the head of Mr. Mighty of his Hands, who, relieved of his devilish burden, was glad to return home safe with his friend. The Buddha, too, went to its abode and there told its fellow goblins how it had involved itself in a great trouble and how narrowly it had escaped. They all laughed at its stupidity and said, "What a great fool you are!" They were not Kutas. In fact, there are no Kutas in the world. They were men, and it was most stupid of you to have got yourself into their hands. Are you not ashamed to make such a fuss about your escape? The injured Buddha retorted that they would not have made such remarks had they seen the Kutas. "Then show us these Kutas, as you choose to call them," said they, "and we will crush them in the twinkling of an eye." "Agreed," said the injured Buddha, and the next night it took them to the house of the Mighties, and said from a distance, "There is their house. I cannot approach it. Do whatever you like." The other Buddhas were amazed at the fear of their timid brother, and resolved among themselves to put an end to the enemies of even one member of their caste. So they went in a great crowd to the house of the Mighties. Some stood outside the house, to see that none of the inmates escaped, and some watched in the backyard, while a score of them jumped over the walls and entered the courtyard. Mr. Mighty of his Hands was sleeping in the veranda, adjoining the courtyard, and when he heard the noise of people jumping about, he opened his eyes, and to his terror saw some Buddhas in the court. Without opening his mouth he quietly rolled himself along the ground, and went to the room where Mr. Mighty of his Mouth was sleeping with his wife and children. Tapping gently at the door he awoke his friend and said, "What shall we do now? The Buddhas have invaded our house, and will soon kill us." Mr. Mighty of his Mouth told him quietly not to be afraid, but to go and sleep in his original place, and that he himself would make the Buddhas run away. Mr. Mighty of his Hands did not understand what his friend meant, but not wishing to argue rolled his way back to his original place and pretended to sleep, though his heart was beating terribly with fright. Mr. Mighty of his Mouth now awoke his wife, and instructed her thus, "My dearest wife, the foolish Buddhas have invaded our house, but if you act according to my advice we are safe, and the goblins will depart harmlessly. What I want you to do is, to go to the hall and light a lamp, spread leaves on the floor, and then pretend to awake me for my supper. I shall get up and inquire what you have ready to give me to eat. You will then reply that you have only pepper water and vegetables. With an angry face I shall say, 'What have you done with the 3 Buddhas that our son caught hold of on his way back from school?' Your reply must be, 'The rogue wanted some sweetmeats on coming home. Unfortunately I had none in the house, so he roasted the 3 Buddhas and gobbled them up.'" Thus instructing his wife, Mr. Mighty of his Mouth pretended to go to sleep. The wife accordingly spread the leaves and called her husband for his supper. During the conversation that followed, the fact that the son had roasted 3 goblins for sweetmeats was conveyed to the Buddhas. They shuddered at the son's extraordinary ability, and thought, "What must the father do for his meals when a son roasts 3 Buddhas for sweetmeats?" So they at once took to their heels. Then going to the brother they had jeered at, they said to him that indeed the Kutas were their greatest enemies, and that none of their lives were safe while they remained where they were, as on that very evening the son of a Kuta had roasted 3 of them for sweetmeats. They therefore all resolved to fly away to the adjoining forest, and disappeared accordingly. Thus Mr. Mighty of his mouth saved himself and his friend on 2 occasions from the Bhutas. The friends after this went out one day to an adjoining village and were returning home rather late in the evening. Darkness fell on them before half the way was traversed, and there lay before them a dense wood infested by beasts of prey. So they resolved to spend the night in a high tree and go home next morning, and accordingly got up into a big pipal. Now this was the very wood into which the Bhutas had migrated, and at midnight they all came down with torches to catch jackals and other animals to feast upon. The fear of Mr. Mighty of his hands may be more imagined than described. The dreaded Bhutas were at the foot of the very tree in which he had taken up his abode for the night. His hands trembled. His body shook. He lost his hold, and down he came with a horrible rustling of leaves. His friend, however, was, as usual, ready with a device, and bawled out, "I wish to leave these poor beings to their own revelry. But you are hungry and must needs jump down to catch some of them. Do not fail to lay your hands on the stoutest Bhuta." The goblins heard the voice which was already very familiar to their ears, for was it not the Kuta whose son had roasted up 3 Bhutas for sweetmeats that spoke? So they ran away at once, crying out, "Alas, what misery! Our bitter enemies have followed us even to this wood." Thus the wit of Mr. Mighty of his mouth saved himself and his friend for the 3rd time. The sun began to rise, and Mr. Mighty of his hands thrice walked round Mr. Mighty of his mouth and said, "My dear friend, truly you only of us 2 are mighty. Mere physical strength is of no use without skill in words. The latter is far superior to the former, and if a man possess both, he is, as it were, a golden lotus having a sweet scent. It is enough for me now to have arrived at this moral. With your kind permission I shall return to my village." Mr. Mighty of his mouth asked his friend not to consider himself under any obligation, and, after honoring him as became his position, he let him return to his village. The moral of this short story is that in man there is nothing great but mind. Thank you for joining us for today's fairy tale. We hope these stories bring joy and meaning to your day. If you love our channel, please hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any exciting tales. Wishing you a good night and sweet dreams. See you in the next story.